So I want to just ask you then about the big themes in Last Tango and Devil's Dictionary. I mean, there's a reasonably high degree of overlap. We've got empathy, environmentalism, um, nature relatedness, which sort of relates to both of those components. Futurism. Can you speak to the big themes across the two books and how they emerged and how those themes are changing between Last Tango and Devil's Dictionary?
The easiest place to start talking about the big themes, I think, is to talk about nature relatedness, and it's sort of like, what does it take to solve our current environmental challenges? And the argument that I'm making in the books and thinking about sort of the major theme, and it's the best sort of place to start answering your question, is talk to most psychologists, Sarah included, about why the world is currently facing so many environmental challenges. One of the main answers you hear is, and I've written a couple of emails, if you read the emails recently, I've written a couple of things about this recently, is the brain, takes in millions and millions of bits of information every second. Consciousness, a couple thousand bits at most, and attention, right? And this is Csikszentmihalyi's work, among other people, is maybe 200, 300 bits. So most of reality gets filtered out, and, the brain is charged with survival. So anything that doesn't help us survive is what goes first. And in the modern world, we live in boxes. We stare at boxes all day, and we stare at boxes inside of boxes. Right now, we're staring at like 11 boxes inside of boxes, right? That's our experience. So the brain says, oh, box world is what's super important to survival. And it starts filtering everything else out, including much of the natural world. So if you talk to psychologists and neuroscientists, they'll say, look, we have this huge problem, which is we literally can't see or perceive what we're trying to protect. And that has to shift. That's a big mind shift. And this is literally a perceptual challenge. It's like a cognitive bias against nature, essentially. So one of the ways this gets shifted is empathy. Empathy expands our sphere of caring, and it expands what information the brain says is important and not important and things like that. And in flow, this is what happens to us. When we're deep in flow, nature relatedness increases, empathy expands. This happens sort of naturally in flow. There's a bunch of different reasons for why, but one of the things that the state does is it expands empathy, it expands nature relatedness. And we know from a lot of, and by the way, flow is not the only altered state that will do this. Meditative states do it, trance states will do it.
Motherhood does it. Like
motherhood,
nursing does it, right? Like
I didn't know that.
There's loads of places where you get this expansion in your capacity to relate and live inside the experience of others, right? So I think there's like loads of states you can get to, but I also think there's like, biological.
Oh, and I will a lot of this. So a lot of my biggest experience with this shift, and a lot of where this book came from, I wrote an email about Misha, right? When we were starting our dog rescue, it was really hard going from like 8 dogs in a pack to 25. Life got really crazy, and we dealt with really severely traumatized dogs with cancer and heart disease and lots of ailments and a lot of like mental challenges, brain damage. And a lot of these dogs were abused, and a lot of the abusers were men. So even though they started healing once they got to our sanctuary, they sort of like come into their personalities, and a lot of those personalities were, we hate men. And I used to get attacked by our dogs on a regular basis. Now, we do small dog rescue predominantly, so these were sometimes Chihuahuas, but I'd get up at 3 o'clock in the morning to go take a piss. I'd be getting back into bed, and I'd get bit. Or this dog, Misha, used to stalk me on my way back from the office. End of the day, I'm exhausted. I've worked like 14 hours, and all I want is food. And Misha would like hide in the fields and try to attack me, and I was getting madder and madder. And I've discovered that if you shout at already traumatized dogs, it's both bad for the dog and very bad for your marriage. So that was not good. Couldn't do more of that. And as a result, I needed a strategy. So I really, out of absolute desperation, I don't even know where the idea came from, I basically sort of forced myself to put my money where my mouth was. I've been walking around talking about equal rights for animals and stuff like that for a long time. And suddenly I was like, okay, you got to treat Misha like he was a close family member, who was losing his mind, who was super angry for whatever reason. And in that case, you wouldn't get mad back. You'd try to calm them down. You try to help them. And so I forced myself every time sort of Misha would try to attack me, I would, treat him as if he was my brother having a nutty, or the way my brothers treated me when I was having a nutty. And the weirdest thing was 2 to 3 weeks in, I started noticing massive amounts of more details about Misha's behavior and all the other animals in the pack. And it was suddenly, since my wife and I started this rescue, Joy, my wife, would always come up to me and say things like, yeah, Misha's having a bad day, blah, 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 this is happening. I had no idea what she was talking about.
Oh, see.
I actually thought she was making it up. I thought she was crazy.
Yeah, she's crazy.
Suddenly, I was like, holy shit, I'm seeing all the details. And with Misha, I started to notice that, like, in the house, if I'd walk into a room, tiny hair in his butt would stand up. And it was the beginning of a fear response. And if I crouched down and talked softly at that moment, it wasn't threatening, he calmed down. And over time, reacting like that changed the whole behavior and everything else. So when I started thinking about the Devil's Dictionary and these things and nature relatedness, that was the shift I was interested in providing with people, because once you start seeing that level of behavior in dogs, once you start noticing that level of detail in dogs, you start to realize that there's so many similarities between dogs and humans at a really deep kind of behavioral level that you don't notice until you start seeing these details. And so empathy for the animal actually, and seeing the animal more as a human being, actually ended up making the animal much more like a human being in the end. And I was like, oh wow, that's an unlocking move. How can other people have that experience? You obviously, I could ask you to like think about the animals in your world differently or the plants in your world differently, but that's why I started thinking about novel psychedelics and things like that. And, you said motherhood produced it. I was interested in stuff that happened naturally, sometimes in flow, sometimes, through a shift in perspective, but both of those things are not super easy to give to people.
Right.
If what you've heard on Flow Research Collective Radio has been helpful, please consider doing us a solid and leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you are listening to this. Reviews help us connect to a wider audience so we can get these peak performance principles out to more people.